Hi, I'm Kristen from ISeeStarsQuilting.com, and today we are going to discuss binding. I get a lot of emails about this. I'm going to show you how I do it today. Make it work, make it fast, make it beautiful, make it good, and super high quality. And, excuse me while I still pick out little strings in here. Your quilt sandwich, real quick rundown, is your quilt top, your batting right here, and your backing. Up until this point, I have sewn the quilt top, pieced it all together. Then I went in and I laid it on top of the backing, then the batting, then the quilt top. Then I machine stitched in a pattern on here. Really simple straight stitch pattern, okay? For the binding, which is the next step, I measured from corner to corner on the top and bottom, and measured from corner to corner on each side. Okay, so what you want to do is you want to find the entire length of the perimeter all the way around your quilt. Okay, the formula for that is 2 times the width plus 2 times the height. Once you have 2 times the width and 2 times the height, you want to add 12 inches. That is going to give you your overlap when you are tying the 2 pieces together on the end. Especially if you have a big quilt, you're going to notice that 2 times the width and 2 times the height does not come out of a 40-inch piece of fabric, right? You're gonna need more than that. I like to do my binding at 2.5 inches. It's a nice, big, thick piece. It gives you a little bit more to work with. I know some people do 2 inches. I like the chunkier binding. This is something you have to decide on your own. It's not written in stone what you have to use, okay? I'm going to take the 2 pieces of binding. Okay, I'm gonna make one go east to west, one go north to south, right sides facing together. So once again, my piece going east to west, my piece going north to south, and I stitched from this corner, you can kind of see with the light pouring through, this corner all the way to this corner right there. When you open this up, boom, right there. So now I have a solid piece of binding right here. Okay, the reason that you want to do it at an angle like this is because it reduces the bulk when you're folding it over on your quilt. If I were to do it just a straight up and down seam, when I fold it over, I don't have 2 layers of fabric there. I have about 6 by the time that you do this. So this just kind of distributes the bulk of the fabric just a little bit further out. Okay, now that you have that, you're going to want to attach all your other pieces in exactly the same manner. Okay, so let me show you what that looks like, okay? Right here, I have this seam that I just created right there, okay? So with everything facing up, facing the right way that I want it to go, I am just going to travel my fabric down until I get to the end of this strip. Everything is still facing up, nothing's been turned or twisted. Now I'm going to take my next piece of fabric and I'm going to lay it on just like that. And I am going to sew from this corner to this corner, just like so. Okay, now when I pull that up, everything is right there. Right here is the new line that I just sewed. Now this may take just a couple times to kind of wrap your head around it. The key thing is if you just keep that fabric facing up and just travel it down here on your sewing machine, you won't have to deal with that. Okay, so next piece I'm going to line up and we're going to stitch one more time right on that diagonal. All right, now that we have all of our seams sewn, we are going to trim off this excess fabric because the whole reason we went around doing the diagonal lines instead of the simple horizontal lines was so that we don't have bulk in our fabric. Now I'm just trimming it with scissors right now, but you can trim it with your rotary cutter. But the whole idea, just do your kind of your 1/4 inch. This isn't going to show on your final piece, okay? So now that you have all of your binding pieces sewn together, you've trimmed off the excess of the little triangles in there, you're going to take this really long piece of binding plus the 12 extra inches, okay, because you're going to need those 12 extra inches, to your pressing table. Iron these seams open and flat. This is the iron that I use all the time. It's my infamous tiny little iron. I cut that one a little bit short. If you want to press your seams to one side, I do that a lot otherwise in my sewing. Press to one side or open. Whichever one, oh, sorry, I'm shaking the whole camera, works for you. So you're gonna press all your seams to the one side. Okay, once you have that, start at one end. You're gonna press your binding in half, okay? Don't worry about anything else, just press it in half all the way down, wrong sides together. It is really important that you do press this and you don't just fudge it as you go. This is one of the things that will make a big difference in the professional quality of your finished piece. I know not all of us are going to be entering into quilt shows where you're going to have some really fancy expert critiquing your quilt and all of that, but you will, you want to impress yourself too on this. Okay, so now that we're back at our sewing machine and I've got my binding, you're going to want to start with about, I don't know, 6 or 8 inches or so. It doesn't have to be exact, from the end of your fabric. Okay, now if you want to take these magic clips and do this to your binding so you know that it stays straight, I've kind of gotten to the point where I don't do that anymore because it is lining up the raw edge, not the ironed edge, the raw edge of your binding with the edge of your fabric. We are going to start on the back side of the quilt here, about 6 or 8 inches down from here, from the end of your binding. I have my 1/4 inch foot. You can see that little bar right here, which I have more pictures of that on my website, is going to keep all of my edges just in line. So now we're going to sew just a 1/4 inch all the way down. What we're going to do is we are going to sew here. That is going to attach the binding to the quilt. Then we are going to fold over, okay? And then we'll attach the front, okay? So you have this nice, beautiful, crisp, clear edge on the front of your quilt. I am starting in the middle of one of my sides. Got about 6 inches or so from the edge of my binding, okay? So now we are going to sew until we get to the first corner, and then I will show you what to do after that. Okay, as you can see, I'm kind of nearing the edge here, my corner right here. So I can feel about where the edge of that quilt is. I want to stop quilting a 1/4 inch from that end, okay? I want to stop quilting a 1/4 inch from the end of the fabric. My needle is down, okay? I'm going to lift up on the presser foot. I'm going to turn just a tad to where this corner is facing straight out here. And then I'm going to sew at a 45-degree angle right off the edge of the quilt and cut. You can see I sewed straight at a 1/4 inch, and then right at the end I went boop on a 45-degree angle. Okay, so what we're going to do next is I'm going to flip up this fabric using that 45-degree line that I sewed as a guide. Kind of make a 45-degree right here with your fabric. You see where I've flipped that up, okay? Simple as that. Use your finger to hold it down. Now, I'm going to flip this back over like so and line it up with this piece of fabric. So what you have right here is a little triangle flap that you have created. This is important to have right here, this little flap, okay? So I'm gonna go through it one more time, a little bit slower so you can see exactly what I did. I have this line right here that I sewed when I sewed 45 degrees off the corner. I'm going to flip the fabric, finger press here. I'm not against finger pressing. It has its places, okay? Finger press here to get it to get down straight. So I've got a 45-degree coming right off of that corner. All right, now I'm going to flip my fabric back to where this, I'm creasing the fabric right along here, matches up perfectly with this straight edge right here, okay? And this raw edge of my binding matches up with the raw edge of my quilt. Then I'm gonna stick it back in the machine, put the needle down. I've got that needle going through all the layers of fabric. I've still got my little triangle flap there, but it is pressed down, okay? So now we're going to sew all the way down this side again. Again, I stopped just a 1/4 inch from the edge here. I'm gonna lift up slightly and turn, and then I'm gonna sew at a 45 degree right off of that corner. Cut it and do the same thing. Flip that fabric up, create a 45 degree right here, finger press it slightly, fold your fabric over again, put your needle down, and sew again. Okay, so I'm coming up on the very last corner here of my quilt. And sometimes it takes a little bit to go around your quilt, but make sure you keep that 1/4 inch seam from your edge. This 1/4 inch foot really does help with that. Down a little bit further is where I started. Right here is where I started. You can see a little bit right there. Leave yourself a good 8 to 12 inches somewhere in there because you'll want to work with that. Now when you're sewing this, back stitch just a little bit to hold that in place, okay? So back stitch just a bit, forward stitch. Now, I've got my 2 ends right here. Trim it down to something that you can kind of work with, okay? Okay, so here is the binding. I do recommend if you are just starting to have about 12 inches here to here. It's a whole lot easier to work with. See, these binding pieces will end up overlapping. I am going to show you an easy way to do this. I want to make it look really nice for whoever you're giving the quilt to, okay? So what I've done here is I've taken this binding piece right here and I have matched up the uneven edges right here on the quilt, okay? So this is my finished edge. This is the uneven edge. I'm going to fold it back on itself right here, okay? I'm going to get my iron out and I'm going to press. Fabric is already straight. You really just want to reinforce that right there, okay? Next, you're gonna take your other side, put it right up next to it, okay? Notice I've got this pressed nice and flat. This one, just fold it back over. You want those seams touching. These seams right here between these two should not overlap. They should just barely touch. Okay. Press it nice and good so that those seams meet up, okay? Next thing we're going to do is open this up. You can see right here that line that I pressed. Okay, see a little bit in the shadows there? Okay, I am going to open up this side and I am going to grab my pin and we are going to pin these two pieces together right where those lines are, okay? Now you need a pin for this because you do not want this moving around on you. Okay, so take a minute to line up this side right there. Take a minute to line up your spot in the middle. This is where having a little bit of extra room is really a good thing. Put your pin in, and then I want you to take it to the sewing machine and stitch right on that folded line that you have there. Okay, so I've got it over here at the sewing machine. What I went ahead and did was I used a fabric marker and I marked this line right here just so you can see a little bit better on camera. If you are sure that you got that line right, you are not, you know, mismeasuring anything, you can do this little trick right here because it gets to be a little cumbersome right here while you're sewing, okay? So I went ahead and I drew it on this line too. That is right on that line that I ironed, okay? If you are sure, you got that line pressed correctly, you can cut. I usually do a little bit over 1/4 of an inch when I cut, just because, you know, mistakes happen and you don't want to be left in the, I did not leave enough fabric, okay? So then what you can do, and this gets to be a little bit cumbersome when you are stitching this, because it just gets to be a little bit tight. But what you can do is line up those lines. You know, I cut away my extra fabric. Then I'm going to flip my quilt. You gotta work with it a little bit. Okay, get those pieces of material nice and flat, okay? So once you've got those pieces nice and flat, do not let that fabric move. Go ahead and sew. I haven't trimmed this at all or anything. I haven't pressed it, but I like to wait to trim it until after I finish this checking step, okay? So what you're gonna do is your quilt should probably fold pretty easy right now. Stretch it out. Make sure there's no extra bumps in here, okay? So this is just a straight seam right here. And I can tell that there's just the right amount of the binding to go on the edge of my quilt here that's raw, okay? So again, I've stitched all the way from here to here, okay? So I can tell there's just enough binding right there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim the extra fabric on the inside to stop that bulk, and then I will press it perfectly, and you will never even be able to tell where this seam meets up, right? It'll be our little secret where that seam is, okay? So open that seam up to kind of reduce the bulk, right? Give it just a little press with your iron, and then you're going to take it back to your sewing machine, and you are going to stitch from here to here in that open space there. In the sewing machine, you can see this is where my seam is that we just sewed together here, okay? So everything is nice and flat along this line, same as if it were along this line right here. It is worth mentioning, if you are putting a label on your quilt, let me show you exactly what you would do. I should have mentioned this before, but if you're putting a label on your quilt, like I've got one of mine right here. It's one of the ones that you just fold in half. You want put your label on the back. When you're doing this, you would put your label underneath your binding like this and stitch that line right there. Okay, so then you would be stitching your label in with your binding, and then you wouldn't have to worry about it. Okay, so next step that I want you to do, this is the fun part. You are going to flip your binding around to the front, okay? This is where you can find little extra threads. Okay, so next you're going to flip your binding around to the front. Okay, so let me flip my quilt over here. You'll want to get out these magic clips, okay? So you're going to flip your binding around to the front. Then you're going to secure it down like this, okay? This is where these clips come in handy. Fun fact with these clips, if you can see the lines right here, those aren't just decoration. Did you know? They are actually measuring tools. So if you have a whole bunch of them in a row and you want to make sure that your quilt is on this line the same as it is further down your quilt on another clip, they're measuring tools. Same for these itty bitty ones, though I don't use them as much for that. It's pretty easy to figure out on your quilt because this raw edge right here that we cut on the quilt is going to be right up next to this line right here, okay? So then you just go around your quilt and put these in. This kind of preps the fabric, okay? The fabric is already used to being bent this way. This is the way the fabric is going to go for always. So you can do this around all the sides of your quilt. Here it is nice and close so you can see. Right there is where my fabric comes to a point. I normally take the right side here, fold it all the way in, okay? You can do it to where this forms that perfect 45 degree, okay? Then you are going to fold it back right here, okay? So you have that 45 degree angle, you're gonna fold it back. In order to get really, really crisp, I like to stick something up right in here, okay? So that the corner right here where that end of the 45-degree starts and you start going along your binding line again, is really crisp. You want that to meet exactly on top of this one, okay? So let me flip it and show you. Right here is what you're wanting. You want that perfect 45-degree to come right out of that corner, okay? And if I hold this tight, you can see that my binding is very nice and square, okay? You want square corners, not rounded corners on here. Work with it a few minutes and then you'll be able to get exactly what you want here. Sometimes you gotta work with it. If your batting is extra thick, it's gonna be a little bit harder to fold. If your binding is really skinny, it's gonna be a little bit harder to fold because you have several layers of fabric. So do this, all 4 corners. Keep clipping your binding all the way around the perimeter. Okay, we're back at the sewing machine. I have switched from the 1/4-inch foot to the stitch and the ditch foot. Excuse me, I don't know the proper term for that, but I call it the stitch and the ditch foot. It doesn't have the little silver bar on the side to keep you at 1/4 of an inch. It has it right down the middle, so you know exactly where you're sewing. What we're going to do is we're going to stitch just barely on the edge of it. You just want to hold it on. That's all you want to do. You just want to hold it on. All right, stitch just a little bit. And because I'm showing this to you, I'm going to show you a couple other tricks too. Don't worry. So this is what you're going for right here. Just a tiny bit on the edge of the fabric. I know my thread's a little bit light here, but you have your binding right here where you originally sewed 1/4 of an inch from the side. So this should be 1/4 of an inch right here. And then you have just a little row of stitches. You have just a little row of stitches right there, which is the back side of this stitch right here. I know several of my readers have mentioned that they have trouble sewing straight lines. Y'all don't even worry about it because everybody has trouble sewing straight lines, okay? It is not a big deal. I'm gonna show you a couple tips that will help you where you don't have to sew that straight line right there, because there's nothing more frustrating than that kind of like wiggling and your binding not getting caught in that line, okay? So first thing I'm gonna show you how to do is zigzag stitch it. I do a lot of my quilts this way, okay? Simply because it's easier, it's a little bit less, I have to be perfect because, you know, when you are a super busy quilter, I don't sacrifice the quality of my finished quilt. So the zigzag stitch is an easy way to make it decorative. Okay, so I'm gonna do a little bit of a zigzag stitch here. You can also play with your other program stitches. This is a really good opportunity to see what else you got in your machine. I mean, see what happens. Okay, so you can play with your zigzag stitch. I'm still keeping things, whoops, and there's the other one. I'm still keeping things nice and even. Little zigzag stitch. Does it hold everything together? It absolutely does. Could you do it in a really contrasting, fun color and make it part of the design? You absolutely could. Okay, and here's what it looks like on the back. Just a simple zigzag stitch. You can't see it very well because it's white thread. That's kind of the point on the back. You want it to blend in. What you want to do is make sure that this stays even. Your binding should be the same width here as it is further down in the quilt, as it is further down in the quilt, okay? So I'm gonna sew a little bit and then I'm gonna show you how to get what you do when you get to the edge, okay? Okay, we're getting close to the edge here. I took off the clip for this corner here. Mind your corners. You want to be super protective of those corners. Make sure they are perfect. As you're coming to it, you can lift that presser foot up to make sure that you don't scrunch up that down there. So. One more, there we go. To catch that binding, okay? Lift up your presser foot. Make sure your needle is down because you don't want that binding to move. All right, and then, all right, and there's your corner right there. You have your perfect 45-degree on this side. Thanks to the work that you did earlier, you have a perfect 45-degree on this side. And it's done. Perfect, done. I swear you will never do another quilt binding any other way. This is really, really easy. You can play around with the sizing of the binding. of your original binding. I did mine at 2.5 inches. You can try 2 inches. That'll get this edge right here on the front of your quilt a little bit closer to the same size on the back. If you have any questions about this, please let me know. You can email me, you can comment on my website, find me, let me know how this works for you. I'm Kristen at ISeeStarsQuilting.com. Happy sewing.